Greetings and happy solstice to everyone. I'm Philip Johnson, the Shoreline and Land Use Manager for the Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition. Oregon Shores is sponsoring tonight's webinar together with our friends and partners, Surfrider Foundation Oregon chapters. Just to briefly introduce Oregon Shores, if you are not familiar with us, Oregon Shores has been around actually 53 years now. We actually predate the land use planning system, which was first instituted in 1973, and we've been working on land use planning issues ever since. Oregon Shores grew out of the group citizen group that pushed for the Oregon Beach Bill back in 1967, which gives us all our iconic public beaches. Oregon Shores works on the full range of issues from the entire coastal region. So we work on land use planning, as you'll be hearing tonight, water quality, shoreline management, marine conservation. We're well known for our Coast Watch volunteer program, which incidentally always needs additional volunteers to help keep watch over the shoreline. You can learn more about that on our website. Some of the key matters we're working on right now include the Clatsop County's current update of their comprehensive plan. We're working on that together with Surfrider. That raises issues such as shoreline armoring, public access, cable crossings. If you're in Clatsop County and are concerned about that, please find us through the website. We'd be glad to talk with you. Another key thing we work on is our campaign for Oregon's estuaries. The state is currently updating, or local jurisdictions with the help of the state are updating estuary management plans for the entire coast, the first two being in Coos Bay and Newport, and we're heavily engaged with that. Another key project is our land use planning network, through which volunteers help us monitor a city or county for land use activity there to serve as an early warning system so that we can be most effective in intervening. We would love to have help with some of the places that are not yet covered. So again, find us through the website. I've been asked in this context to mention, by the way, that there is another land use group that works on coastal land use, the Oregon Coast Alliance, which also invites people to contact them if they want help with local land use issues. And finally, as a bit of a preview, we and Surfrider are organizing a long-term campaign, which we're calling Oregon Beaches Forever, that will look at the long-term future of our beaches in the era of sea level rise. We'll be rolling that out and really going public with it next month, but it is a key activity, and the things you'll be learning tonight will definitely have a bearing on the kinds of ways in which you can get involved in that in the future. At this point, I was going to introduce Kaya Hazard, my counterpart with Surfrider, to say a few words about their organization. However, she's traveling somewhere and has poor Wi-Fi connection. So on her behalf, I will say, the Surfrider Foundation is a grassroots organization dedicated to the protection and enjoyment of the world's ocean, waves, and beaches for all people through a powerful activist network. In Oregon, Surfrider works to protect special places on coasts and oceans, have clean waves to swim and surf in, to create resilient and healthy coastal habitats and communities, and foster stewardship of the land and sea by connecting folks to the Pacific Ocean and the wild coast. To learn more about Surfrider's initiative and direct action campaigns and how you can get involved, visit them at their website, oregon.surfrider.org. As you might guess, if you want to seek out Oregon Shores, our website is oregonshores.org. So we have two panelists tonight. I'll introduce them both now so we can segue more directly later on. The first is Meg Reed, who's the Coastal Policy Specialist for the Oregon Coastal Management Program, which is directed by the Department of Land Conservation and Development. In that role, she handles policy and also works with to assist local communities, cities and counties in planning for shorelands and estuaries. Previously, she was the department's coastal shores specialist, dealing more specifically with beaches and dunes and coastal hazards. And all of these matters are, of course, of keen interest to us, so we interact with her a great deal. In that role, in fact, she worked with us on our King Tides photography project, chronicling the highest tides of the year. Prior to that, she was the environmental programs coordinator for the State Marine Board. And in her first role in the state, she was a NOAA Coastal Management Fellow with both state parks and the Department of Land Conservation and Development, inventorying coastal properties to determine their eligibility for shoreline armoring. So that's highly relevant to us, and we got to know her at that point. She has her master's from the University of New Hampshire. The second speaker then is Eric Riston. He's an attorney with the Craig Law Center. Oregon Shores has had about a 20-year now partnership with the Craig Law Center, what we call our Coastal Law Project, and Eric is now the attorney we work with through that project. Eric also does work with Surfrider as well. He has his JD from the Harvard Law School, and prior to joining Craig, he was legal fellow with the Environmental Defense Fund. So again, as I said at the outset, questions in the Q&A, if you would, and we will answer any and all. We'll stick around as long as there are questions. And if you want to convey some other comment to us, then you can use the chat. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and invite Meg Reed to step in.
Thanks, Philip. I'll get my slides up. Can you all see that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great, thanks. So yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to collaborate with Oregon Shores and Surfrider tonight. I'm going to give just a little bit of a primer on the land use planning system in Oregon and coastal management here, as we are sort of a unique snowflake compared to others in the country. And then I'll pass it to Eric to dive into a little more on the details of some of the statewide planning goals. So to start, I'm going to give just kind of a little background on coastal management and why DLCD is sort of the home of the coastal management program before diving into a little bit more specifics. So some of you might remember the Coastal Zone Management Act of 1972 was passed with some other pretty big pieces of environmental legislation at the federal level at that time. And the sort of impetus for this law was because the federal government realized that many coastal communities were where the populations were. People really tend to live at the coastlines, and they're very important to national security, to commerce, for lots of reasons. The shorelines are very important to the country as a whole. However, the federal government doesn't really have land use authority and regulatory authority in that same way that states do. So they created this partnership, which is a voluntary program between coastal states and territories and the federal government. And that's really based on two main incentives for coastal states to join this program. One is money, so federal funding coming right to the states to do coastal zone management. And then the second is federal consistency authority. So we have a coastal zone management program here in Oregon. It was the second approved in the nation in 1977, just after Washington, which we're pretty proud of. And we have a pretty large coastal zone, and that map there on my slide show what is our coastal zone in Oregon. It's roughly the crest of the Coast Range out to the edge of the territorial sea, which is 3 nautical miles from the coastline. And that's a watershed-based approach for the coastal zone, which is actually somewhat different from a lot of other coastal states who have more of a narrow strip. For example, in California, the coastal zone is about 500 to 1,000 feet from their shoreline. So we have a much larger coastal zone, and that means every city and county in that area is part of our coastal management program, as well as all the state agencies that have authority and regulations in the coastal zone. So our program is made up of the statewide land use planning program, as well as our territorial sea plan. And we have a large partnership, which I'll show in my next slide. But I wanted to also kind of touch on this middle piece here, federal consistency authority, because that is kind of a unique thing that coastal programs get, which means that we are able to apply state policies, and because of the way our program is set up, also local policies to federal actions and federal permits that are taking place in Oregon's coastal zone. And so that means things like that the Army Corps of Engineers is doing themselves, such as like a dredging project or jetty repair, and also permits that federal agencies give out. So the removal fill permits and other kinds of permits that federal agencies are giving out to other applicants. We get an opportunity to review those against the state's policies. And that doesn't happen in other landscapes. So any other place, in inland states or even past Oregon's coastal zone, we are not able to apply state level policies to federal actions or activities. So it's a pretty unique opportunity to share power with the federal government. So in Oregon, as I mentioned, it's sort of a networked program. So we have the Oregon Coastal Management Program, and the lead administrator is the Department of Land Conservation and Development, which is the agency that I work for. We have several state agency partners that are listed there with their acronyms, like the Department of State Lands, Department of Environmental Quality, Department of Energy, Department of Parks and Recreation, and so on. And then we have all of the coastal counties. There are 8. It also includes Columbia County, and then all of the city partners that are in those jurisdictions as well. So it's a pretty large network. And we are the lead at DLCD because we are also home of the state's land use planning program, which is also a pretty unique program and was established around the same time as the Coastal Zone Management Act and the Oregon's coastal program. So they really go hand in hand. And that was the passage of Senate Bill 100 in 1973. And so as Philip was alluding to, we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the passage of that bill. And that really established a foundation of statewide land use planning on 19 foundational goals, but that are really implemented locally through city and county comprehensive plans. And so with that planning program, there were really 3 big ideas that were being implemented. One is the idea of urban growth boundaries, so containing urban development into existing urbanized and developed places and not allowing for sprawl. So we have pretty compact development. Urban areas are urban and rural areas are rural. And that leads very closely with the second big idea, which is to protect resource lands. So farm and forest land, those are really some of the foundational goals. Sorry, my daughter's here, and so I might have to just.
Mommy, I don't know
One second.
how to turn on.
The joys of single parenting. So anyway, protect resource lands is the second big idea. And so farm and forest, like I said, but also coastal resources and other natural resources. So that was really part of the planning system. And then big idea number 3 is that plans are comprehensive. So comprehensive plans cover everything from citizen involvement, transportation, economic development, resource protection, all of those things. Some of the goals are process-based, while others are based on resource protection, whereas others are urbanization type goals. And just wanted to also show that this is kind of just a general map of zoning in Oregon. So really, the planning program is essentially zoning, and that every inch of the state is zoned except for federal lands and tribal lands, at least under statewide zoning. And here is the list of the 19 statewide planning goals. The last 4 are highlighted in blue because those are the coastal goals. They were sort of being established at the same time as the rest of the goals were being developed. And they really are the foundation of our coastal management program. So those are the reasons why we are able to meet the requirements of the Coastal Zone Management Act, is through the establishment of those coastal goals. And the way that they're implemented, as I mentioned, is really through city and county comprehensive plans, as well as state agency authorities. So for example, fish passage rules through the Department of Fish and Wildlife, removal fill laws with the Department of State Lands, and so on. And then this drawing on the right side of the screen is really kind of what is a comprehensive plan. It's kind of usually an overarching document with big policies, and then how it's carried out is through zoning ordinances and code. And then they usually also have plan maps. So those are the pieces of a comprehensive plan that implement the statewide planning goals. They are regulatory documents and everyone has to comply with them. The same with goals. The name goal is sort of lofty, but it is law. They are rules that are codified in statute. So they are the law of the land. And so this is just my last slide, which is just kind of showing those coastal goals again, which I know Eric will go into more detail of. But this is a wonky slide, but it's really to show that the coastal goals are very spatial in their implementation. So goal 16 is estuaries, which applies to the waters of estuaries. Goal 17 is the lands adjacent to the estuaries, as well as beaches and dunes, the ocean, shore, and coastal lakes. Goal 18 is beaches and dunes, so that's the sandy areas on the outer coast. And goal 19 is ocean resources. And that is one of the unique goals in that it's the only goal that is implemented solely by the state, and local governments don't have a role in the implementation of goal 19. So I will leave it there and I'll pass it to you, Eric.
Mommy.
Thanks, Meg. That was great. Let me. All right, can everyone see those slides okay?
Yep, that's fine.
Great. Well, again, thank you, Meg and Philip, for the introduction here. Like Meg said, I'm going to zoom in on a little bit more detail on the land use planning system and how it applies in the coastal zone. Just to kind of lay out where we're going to go here, I'm going to start diving into a little bit more detail with those coastal land use goals that Meg just mentioned. And then I'm going to talk about some land use issues that we see that affect coastal resources and kind of talk about those in the context of those goals. Next, I'm going to kind of talk about how to get involved at the local government level, how you as individuals can participate in this process and you get involved with issues that concern you. And then finally, I'm going to talk about a couple case studies that kind of put all that stuff together and just kind of give an example of how you can get involved and raise your voice on issues that you care about. So you've already met me through those introductions, but just to give a quick pitch for Crag Law Center, where I work. Crag is a nonprofit environmental law center that supports people fighting protected ecosystems, climate, and communities across the Pacific Northwest by providing free and low-cost legal aid to communities that are seeking to fight for the environment. You can learn more about us on our website, crag.org, and sign up for our newsletter to keep up to date with the things we're working on. So like I said, going to start here by talking about some detail on the coastal land use goals and how they line up with some of the issues that we care about and hopefully some of the issues that you care about. Like Meg mentioned, there are 19 statewide land use planning goals, and those are really the backbone for Oregon's land use system. They provide the roadmap for how local governments go about their land use planning. Like Meg also mentioned, these policies are really broad and cover a lot of topics. And there are 4 that are targeted specifically at coastal resources that I'm going to talk about in addition to 1 targeted at natural hazards. So the first goal we have here is goal 16. And for a lot of this presentation, we're going to be focusing more on the shorelands, dunes, and beaches, but you really can't talk about coastal planning without at least mentioning goal 16. That being said, this is a really complex and detailed subject, and we'd really need its own webinar just to scratch the surface here, but I'm going to try to cover just some of the basics. Estuaries are where fresh water from rivers and streams mingle with salt water from the ocean. Some of the bigger estuaries that I know many of you are familiar with are the Columbia River Estuary, Coos Bay Estuary, and the Yaquina Bay Estuary. And each of these estuaries are really important and sensitive ecosystems that help support coastal communities in Oregon. Pictured here, you see some eelgrass beds, which are a native ecosystem in Oregon's estuaries that provide some really crucial habitat for a lot of our marine species. That's things like Dungeness crab, salmon, halibut, and a long, long list of other species. Goal 16 covers these estuaries by setting out a framework for how local governments should manage them. Each estuary gets a designation. It's either named development, natural, or conservation, and that controls the kind of development or uses that can be allowed in them. And then after that, each individual estuary is further broken down into development, natural, or conservation management units. And that means that in a development estuary, there's still parts of the estuary or management units that are targeted for conservation and are more restricted in the kinds of uses that can be allowed in them. Next on our list of goals here is goal 17, which applies to coastal shorelands. Like Meg mentioned, the coastal shorelands are defined to include any lands that are contiguous with the ocean, estuaries, or coastal lakes. Under this goal, local governments have to inventory geologic and hydrologic hazards, as well as shoreland values, and meet some standards that the goals set out based on that inventory. The purpose of the goal is really to protect the shoreland's value for protection and maintenance of water quality, fish and wildlife habitat, water-dependent uses, economic resources, and recreation and aesthetics. Certain areas of the shorelands are more restricted in the uses that can be allowed in them. These include things like major marshes and significant wildlife habitat, where the uses are really limited to protect those important resources. Goal 17 also provides that land use management practices and non-structural solutions to problems of erosion and flooding shall be preferred to structural solutions, meaning that decisions about where development goes and non-structural solutions to erosion and flooding should be preferred over structural solutions like shoreline armoring and riprap, which should be more of a last resort. We're going to talk a little bit more about shoreline armoring and riprap throughout this presentation. So if you all are not familiar with it, just hang in there a little bit. Onto the next goal, goal 18. Goal 18 is targeted at beaches and dunes. It's really meant to both protect the resources and benefits of our dunes and beaches and reduce the hazards associated with developing in those areas. Goal 18 prohibits residential development on beaches and foredunes that are subject to ocean undertopping or wave overtopping, as well as any interdune areas that are subject to flooding. The goal also provides that local governments should mandate all development in beaches and dunes to minimize erosion. And finally, one of the more important pieces of Goal 18 is that it bars beachfront protective structures like riprap unless development existed on those sites prior to 1977. All right, the final of the 4 coastal goals is Goal 19. Like Meg mentioned, this is the only goal not primarily implemented by local governments, but implemented by the state. And what it does is set some really ambitious goals and standards for uses of the ocean that any proposed ocean development has to meet. For example, one of the key provisions of Goal 19 is that all actions in the ocean should be conducted to conserve marine resources and ecological functions for the purpose of providing long-term ecological, economic, and social values and benefits, and to give higher priority to the protection of renewable marine resources, i.e. living marine organisms, than to the development of non-renewable ocean resources. Goal 19 and that policy I just read to you ends up being a really important enforceable policy in the Oregon Coastal Management Program because, like Meg outlined, federal actions in the ocean, like the proposed leases for floating offshore wind that are going on right now that some of you may have heard about, have to comply with that pretty ambitious and broad standard through the federal consistency review process that Meg touched on. All right, the final goal we're going to talk about is Goal 7 for natural hazards. It's not exclusively a coastal goal like the other 4 we just talked about, but it still has some really big implications for coastal planning. The hazards the goal is concerned with include floods, landslides, earthquakes, tsunamis, and coastal erosion. The picture you see here is a pretty strong example of the dangers that coastal erosion poses. Local governments under the goal are tasked with inventorying areas where these hazards exist, and then creating policies in their comprehensive plans to mitigate the risks of those hazards. Goal 7 also provides that these comprehensive plan policies should avoid development in hazard areas where the risk to people and property cannot be mitigated. Okay, now that we're through some of the more technical stuff, we're going to talk about some of the issues that get raised by land use planning on the coast and look at some special areas of concern for coastal conservation and protecting public access. So first up, and this may be one of the more obvious issues we talk about, but land use is really important to ensuring development does not happen and the sensitive ecosystems that exist in all the coastal areas covered by the goals we just talked about. This issue is really broad, but there are a lot of decisions made in the land use system about whether a given development can happen, whether a property should be rezoned, or whether a proposed use can happen that have really deep implications for these sensitive ecosystems. For example, coastal marshes provide really critical habitat for a lot of birds, fish, and other wildlife, and accordingly, development in those marshes is often unwise, and proposals for such development can be an important point to engage. Luckily, many of the goals we just talked about, including Goal 17, have provisions targeted specifically at those marshes and associated wildlife habitat. Another example, which you see in the picture on the slide, is the site for the Facebook cable, which was an undersea cable to be landed on the beach at Tierra del Mar. As some of you may know, the installation of the cable was a bit of a disaster and ended up causing a lot of disturbance to the local community, public access, and threatened the nearshore and marine environment through spewing drilling fluid and the company leaving abandoned equipment there in the ocean. Siting of cables like this is a really important land use issue, as in addition to the permits and authorizations that are needed from the state, cable landings also require land use permits from local governments. So we touched directly on this issue, coastal hazards, a little bit when we talked about Goal 7, which is targeted specifically at hazards. But I want to talk a little bit more specifically about some of the issues we're seeing with regards to coastal hazards in land use planning on the coast, and some important areas to advocate to ensure smart planning here. The photo is obviously another really good example of where erosion presents a serious hazard to people and property. And as climate change is intensifying and sea levels continue to rise, erosion on the coast is just going to become a bigger and bigger hazard, and it's going to continue to move inland. And the same is true for flooding. Because of that, it's really critical to start the conversation now about where we should be developing in light of those hazards and how we should be planning to combat those hazards in the future. Thinking about these hazards, is important in pretty much every coastal land use decision, in addition to decisions about whether an individual development should be allowed in a hazard area. Broader planning through land use regulations and comprehensive plan amendments need to take these hazards into consideration in light of climate change and rising sea levels when they're setting the broader policies that control where development can happen. All right, the final issue that I'm going to highlight is public access. And land use is also really important here for making sure that there's continued public access to our beaches and other recreation spots. As Meg highlighted, thanks to Oregon's Beach Bill, we all enjoy in Oregon the unique resource of a public right to our beaches. Despite that, though, certain coastal development can still threaten public access, especially in light of rising sea levels and increasing erosion. We talked about shoreline armoring and riprap a couple of times already, and I promised I'd get back on it, and here we are, and we're going to zoom in a little more. Like I mentioned, Goal 18 restricts shoreline armoring to places where development existed before 1977. However, that definition of development is really broad, so more properties than you think would end up being eligible. Additionally, some properties are able to get exceptions to Goal 18 from their local government, which allows them to build even where Goal 18 would otherwise prohibit it. That is a great example of the kind of local land use procedure that we're going to talk about a little later that can be really important to get some community voices on. As you can see from the picture here, the issue with shoreline armoring and riprap is that it takes up needed public beach space. And as sea levels keep rising, the amount of public beach space that it's taking up is going to continue to grow, restricting public access along the beach in armored places. Indeed, in some places, again, like the picture, riprap already makes passage along the beach really hard or impossible at certain tides. And eventually, as erosion continues to move inland, there aren't going to be beaches in places that have been armored. So shoreline armoring, we were talking about in terms of public access, but of course, it not only threatens public access, but is also a threat to sensitive coastal ecosystems. You can see in this photo a before and after from Pine Beach, which I think well illustrates the stark contrast shoreline armoring can make on the nature of our shorelines. This kind of riprap, of course, is also a direct result of the hazards we just talked about. So in an ideal world, of course, riprap wouldn't be necessary because we'd be planning our land use in such a way that development would not occur in an area at threat of erosion. So that was the land use goals, and then some of the issues that we see in land use planning and how they're important in local decision making. Now we're going to talk about how to get involved. If you care about those issues, if you care about other issues, how to come to your local government and raise your voice when a decision's being made. So the first step here to getting involved is just to figure out your local government's process for making land use decisions, because that can vary a lot across different cities and counties, and it also depends on the types of decisions being made. The likely decision makers include your city council or your board of county commissioners for changes to the comprehensive plan or land use ordinances, and the planning commission for decisions on individual permits or authorizations. The best place to start here is really getting familiar with your local government's website, if they have one, which most do, but not all, particularly the page for the planning department, if they have one. That is the most common location where all pending land use decisions and notices of hearings on these decisions are going to be posted. The website should also have the local government's land use, zoning, or development ordinances, which should lay out the procedure your local government follows in more details. And when you can't find something, definitely do not be afraid to ask the local planning department official. Many times they're able to help you figure out where these things are located. All right, so once you've kind of gotten a grip on how your local government makes decisions, the next step is just to track those actions and see what's going on. Property owners near the site of a given land use application are entitled to notice of hearings within a certain range, but that depends on whether or not the property is an urban growth boundary, and the distance that is not that great. In an urban growth boundary, the distance is 100 feet, and it kind of grows from there, but in most cases, you're still going to have to rely on your own research to figure out the actions your local government is taking. Like I mentioned before, the local government's website is really your best friend, her worst enemy in some cases where they're a little inaccessible, but that is where you're going to be able to keep up to date on the big land use decisions that are being made. And in many cases, there's at least some kind of calendar for the decision-making bodies like the Planning Commission that will show when a hearing is being held on a land use matter and have the information you need for it. It's also important to know whether there are any other places your government posts notice of these hearings, which again depends on the government, and will often be laid out in the development or zoning ordinances I mentioned before. For example, the city of Bandon requires that notice of a hearing be published on the city's website or in a locally circulated newspaper. Finally, of course, it's also just important to keep an ear to the street about proposed new development that might be happening. You know, if you hear rumor about a new resort that's being planned, it's probably likely that that resort is going to need some land use approvals from your local government that are going to result in the kinds of hearings that you can come participate in and raise any issues that you see. All right, now's the fun part. We're going to talk about actually participating in those land use hearings and having your voice heard when your local government's making decisions. There's another 3 steps within this third step, and those are first to identify the relevant criteria, gather your evidence, and then finally, of course, testify and submit your comments. On identifying the relevant criteria, what we're talking about is really figuring out which local ordinances, comprehensive plan provisions, or statewide land use goals apply. The hearing notice, which should be posted on the website if that's where you found it, or in the notice if you got notice, is a really great place to start here. as it should provide all of the applicable criteria identified by the planning department. Staff reports, which should be made available a week before a hearing, are more detailed sources of that same information and should also give an outline of how the local planning department thinks the action lines up with the given criteria. That being said, it's still really important to do your own research here. Things can be missed, and you should be really sure to familiarize yourself with the relevant local ordinances, the local comprehensive plan, and the statewide planning goals. Location can make a really big difference here in which criteria apply. For example, is the property that's in the action in a floodplain, shorelands, airport, or is it in a wildlife overlay? If it's farm or forest land, all of those questions just have a really big impact on which criteria are going to apply and are kind of an important first step to thinking about what other things not listed in the staff report might be there. So next, once you've figured out the different criteria that might apply, it's important to build the record with as much evidence as you can and frame that evidence in terms of how it lines up with the criteria you identified. For example, if you are concerned that a proposed development is going to affect estuarine habitat and your local government has an ordinance that you found that says development in the relevant zone is only allowed where it's not going to impact estuarine resources, it's important to have some evidence about why you think that development is going to be harmful. Have other similar developments caused issues in the area? Is there research online about similar impacts from that kind of development on estuaries or watersheds? And what kind of habitats are specifically at risk in the proposed location? Once you've identified those criteria and gotten your evidence together, it's time to put it all into action. Usually there's an allocated amount of time for the testimony. It's normally around 3 minutes. And obviously that's really quick, so it's important to have your thoughts organized going in. And I recommend writing out your testimony beforehand. And doing that also allows you to submit written testimony to the decision maker, so there's a record of it. And you can also include more detail there than you'd be able to fit into 3 minutes. In order for your testimony or comments to have the most impact, like I've said, it's really important to frame them in the context of the applicable criteria. This on the screen here is a really helpful framework for writing your testimony to do this. This IRAC framework here is basically 50% of what you learn in law school. So you all are saving a lot of money that I did not by learning this. First, when you're writing your testimony, what you're going to do is state the issue you're concerned about. Next, you're going to give the rule that you think applies, which is, the state law, land use goal, local code, or comprehensive plan provision that you think applies. And then you're going to explain why you think those rules have not been met here based on the information and evidence you gathered and the information in the application. And then finally, you're just going to restate, again, your concern and give the request that you're making of the decision maker, whether it's to deny the application or put conditions on it, whatever it may be. We're going to go through this framework a little bit more detail when we go through some examples here in a minute. But this really is the kind of baseline for how to write a really effective comment or give really effective testimony. One last thing to mention here is that by default, most local governments are going to close the record at the close of the hearing, which means that new information or new comments can't be submitted after the end of the hearing. But you are allowed to request a continuance of the hearing, and in that case, the government must either continue the hearing at a later date or leave the record open for written comment or additional information for at least a week. Okay, now we're gonna apply all the barrage of information we just learned and some case studies. The first case study, surprise, surprise, sticking with our theme of talking about shoreline armoring, is an application for a Goal 18 exception for a shoreline permit. Shoreline structures require a permit from Oregon Parks and Recreation Department, which is another great opportunity for public comment that we're not going to talk about that here. However, before a landowner can get that permit, they need to get certification from the local government that their property is eligible in the first place, and that it'll be allowed under the local land use regulations. One thing that happens fairly often is that even though Goal 18 prohibits the construction of shoreline armoring structures like riprap, unless a property was developed before 1977, a landowner gets an exception to that goal from the local government that makes them eligible. So that is basically what this case study is an example of. In this case study, what you see pop up on the agenda of your local city council meeting is an exception for a shoreline permit. It's a beachfront condo complex that was developed well after 1977, seeking that exception. It raises some red flags for you when you're looking at it on the website, because the beach at issue is a really important spot for recreation, and it hasn't been riprap extensively yet. It's pretty pristine. And after going and looking at the site in question, you actually think there might be space on the property for condos to be moved landward and thus avoid the need for the structure in the first place. So after you took that first step and kind of saw what was going on here, you go searching for relevant criteria, and you learn that the applicant is pursuing this exception under the reasons exception of Goal 2, which requires that reasons justify why the state policy embodied in the applicable goals should not apply. With that in mind, you go looking at Goal 18 to understand the policy of it there, and it says that its policy is to conserve, protect, where appropriate develop, and where appropriate restore the resources and benefits of the coastal beach and dune area. The applicant's only argument in their application for this development is that the reasons justify the exception because the property is at threat from erosion. So going back to the framework for writing comments that we were talking about, it's time to kind of take the evidence that was just gathered and frame it up in terms of the applicable criteria you identified, and tell the city council why you're concerned. Here's kind of what I would say based on all of that information I just shared. The issue here is that the proposed shoreline structure is going to restrict public beach access. The rule that we have is that one of the factors for a Goal 2 exception is whether reasons justify why the state policy embodied in the applicable goals should not apply. And with that, you get to your analysis that the state policy in the Goal 18 prohibition is to conserve and protect the resources and benefits of the beach for the public. And here, no reason justifies why this policy should not apply, because the proposed structure is going to have a harmful impact on public enjoyment on the beach, which is one of the goals of Goal 18. Further, the applicant has other options to reduce the risk of the erosion that they haven't fully explored. Then, with that analysis, you would conclude that the city council should deny the exception here because it's going to restrict public beach access and because the applicant has other alternatives. All right, this is our second and final case study. This one's a little bit more straightforward. We have another great coastal erosion hazard pictured here. And you see on your city's planning commission website, it should be actually county's planning commission website, that a developer is seeking approval for a new subdivision in Coos County in an area that you worry isn't far enough set back from the beach and it's going to be at risk of future erosion. You've seen other properties on the same beach have problems with erosion, and they've had to riprap or create other shoreline structures, but you know that this property was developed after 1977 and wouldn't be eligible for that without an exception. Knowing that Goal 7 requires local governments to have some policies for hazard mitigation, you go and you look into Coos County's comprehensive plan to see if there's anything relevant in there, and find a provision which says that Coos County shall regulate development in known areas potentially subject to natural disasters and hazards so as to minimize possible risks to life and property. With all that in mind, it's time to testify again, this time to the Coos County Planning Commission, and here's kind of what I would say. The issue here is that the proposed development is in a hazard area, And the rule is that Coos County's comprehensive plan requires risk to be minimized in known hazard areas. So the analysis you would give is that the development should not be allowed as proposed because it's going to create significant hazard risk due to its location contrary to the Coos County comprehensive plan. Other similar situated properties have been placed at risk by erosion by the area, and allowing this development to go through would not meet the county's duty to minimize risk to property and life as expressed in the comprehensive plan. So to conclude, the Planning Commission should deny this application because it creates unnecessary hazard risk. All right, that was the presentation. Thank you for bearing with me. Just to sum up a couple of big takeaways, I hope you come away from this with. First off, land use planning is really key to coastal conservation and to protecting public access to Oregon's beaches. And with that in mind, public involvement in land use planning really can make a big difference in local decision making. And it's both doable and important for community to get involved. And anyone can be a land use expert just by digging in a little bit to their local government and figuring out what's going on. And then just to reiterate the opportunities that Philip mentioned, there is a process going on in Clatsop County for updating plans, their comprehensive plan for goals 16, 17, and 18, the 3 of the coastal goals we just talked about, and keep an eye out for updates from Oregon Shores and Surfrider for future events, talk a little bit more about that. And then also, like Philip mentioned, make sure to volunteer as a land use scout for Oregon Shores on their website if you have the chance, and also take a look at the posted land use guide on their website. That has most of the information that I just gave you and is a really great resource if you are interested in getting involved. And with that, I think we move to questions if anyone has any that they'd like to ask.
Thanks, Eric. While we're waiting for any to come in, I just wanted to quickly follow up by saying, one, you've got a lot of information here, and if it felt like drinking from a fire hose, this has been recorded, and I'm not sure quite how quickly, but within a week or two, it should be up on our Oregon Shores YouTube channel. So you will have a chance to revisit all of this and at your own pace in the future. Second, so Eric's done a great, thorough job of walking you through all the things you would do as an individual getting involved. I want to assure you Oregon Shores works with people in their communities all the time. So if you are concerned about land use issues in your area, please do feel free to contact Oregon Shores. You can contact me directly, Philip with 2 L's at oregonshores.org, or just go to the oregonshores.org website and find us through that. And thirdly, just to underscore what Eric just said, on our website, you will find a link to a quite thorough volunteer guide for getting involved in land use matters that, again, will take you step by step through all the things Eric's been talking about and more. You can find that on the article on our website about our land use monitoring network. We call it the Land Use Scouts program, and then there's a link to it there. I think Eric and Meg must have been very thorough. We're not getting questions, although there's one in the chat, which I think I'll first toss to Eric or Meg if they want to answer, and then I might weigh in too. Jim Graham just comments apparently during this sequence where Eric was talking about riprap and how it can affect the future of beaches and lead to the loss of public access. And he comments that comparing July to January, I'm not sure whether we did that or not, and alleging cause and effect based only on riprap is disingenuous at best. Does Eric or Meg want to respond to that first?
Yeah, I think he's talking specifically about the before and after photo that we have at Pine Beach. And point taken a little bit, but I think regardless of the season, you can see in that photo that the trees aren't not just, lacking leaves because it's January. The trees in the photo are gone because there's a new structure there.
I'll just chime in to say, I mentioned just at the outset that Oregon Shores and Surfrider are partnering on a new campaign, which we haven't really gone public with it yet. We're going to do so in next month. We're calling it the Oregon Beaches Forever campaign. And the idea is to start a statewide conversation about the long-term future of our beaches. So you can quibble about how much of the narrowing beach right now has been caused by riprap starving beaches of their sand supply. But we're looking decades down the road as sea level continues to rise and where it can scour, actually increase erosion in front of riprap and other shoreline armoring structures and cause our beaches to be squeezed between sea level rise and that shoreline armoring. So, the issue isn't what's happening right now. The issue is that long-term future. Boy, you guys did a great job because nobody seems to have any questions. I'd like to toss in a couple to take advantage of my own webinar here. Partly just to clarify, because goals in a lot of people's mind convey something aspirational. This is our goal. We hope to do this. So these goals have actual force of law, right? Because you got to clarify what a goal is in our land use system in terms of its legal force.
Yeah, that's right. The statewide land use goals do have the force of law. And the kind of impact of that differs a lot. A lot of the goals are really just speaking to what the local governments should be doing as they're initially writing their comprehensive plans and now as they're continuing to update those comprehensive plans. But yes, all the goals we talked about are, enforceable laws that are just confusingly named because Oregon likes to be a little unique.
Okay, another thing, again, with not to preempt anybody else, but I'd like to just ask both of you, if you would, to talk a little bit about the relationship between Goal 17 and Goal 18. And I put that in two contexts. One of the issues that Eric's raised is cable crossings. As both Eric and Meg discussed. So Goal 19 covers the territorial sea, first 3 miles off Oregon shores that are state waters, and the state has standards for cable crossings over the seabed in the state lands on those 3 miles. And then there's the issue of cables crossing the shore, such as we showed, Eric showed the slide of the disastrous situation that took place Sierra Del Mar. In general, I'm curious as to how you see linking decisions about the cables crossing the seabed with then what happens when the cable crosses the shore and gets up onto what would be then, perhaps into Goal 17, well, Goal 18 and then Goal 17 lands, the beaches and the shorelands. And then similarly, with planning for estuaries, where Goal 16 deals with the estuary per se after the high tide line, and Goal 17 is dealing with the lands immediately adjacent. So I'm just was hoping each of you would kind of ruminate on how we link those goals. Eric, you want to go first?
Yeah, I can go first. I mean, I think, the answers in the question a little bit in terms of there is already a pretty comprehensive plan for these cable crossings in the territorial sea plan for the water portion of it. But even though, Goal 17 and Goal 18 are targeted at the shorelands and at the beaches and dunes and conserving the resources there, this is, a relatively new problem, and there haven't been a lot of local planning efforts that I'm aware of. Meg can definitely correct me if I'm wrong, to think about how these cables, when they move from being covered by the territorial sea plan to being covered by the land side, which is going to go into the jurisdiction of the local governments, are being covered and thought about. But it's certainly a really important issue, and something that as local governments are going through some of their comprehensive plan updates, like the Clatsop County Comprehensive Plan Amendment that we have mentioned, should be being considered as these crossings become more common.
Yeah, I think you're right, Eric, that local governments haven't necessarily really addressed it specifically in their comprehensive plans. And I think the studies that have recently been done related to undersea cables in the territorial sea have sort of highlighted that as a gap. like it's covered in the ocean policies through state permitting, but not specifically addressed through local plans. So that is yet to be done. It's, you know, potentially already covered depending on what it is, like if it's a manhole cover or drilling or whatever the activities or uses are, through other, like the development permit generally in any of those areas, and then also through the ocean shore through the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department. If it's an ocean shore alteration, then a permit would be required and they would have to meet those criteria. The same if it comes into a city or county's jurisdiction, then they would have to get the local permit. But I think what you're asking is like, if then there could be more specific criteria created to address this particular development. And I think that's like where there is a gap that could be addressed. I don't know that there's anything in the goals that would sort of, you know, mandate that, but we could, you know, certainly help cities and counties who are trying to address that. And I think maybe you were there, Phil, when we talked about in Clatsop County for their update. So potentially something to think through there.
I was just about to say, especially for those of you in Clatsop County, cable crossings are something that can be addressed in the current update process for their goal 17 and goal 18. No other, wait, maybe there is a question. Yes, someone asks, I think Eric started to touch on this, but how can local and state governments help more with coast conservation and protecting coastal resources?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of what we've talked about. The biggest important thing here, as Philip's last question is kind of an example of, is, you know, when local governments are going through and thinking about their comprehensive plans or their zoning ordinances, that's a really big opportunity to think kind of broader about some of these coastal resources. The same is true for the estuary management plans that we talked about for goal 16. Those plans are, some of them are in the process of being updated right now, like in Yaquina Bay. And, you know, we expect more of them to continue to be updated and thinking about how those resources are being protected, especially thinking about climate resilience there. So that's really the big thing, you know, the big picture is that there's these opportunities for local governments to put provisions into law that are gonna protect coastal resources based on the mandates from the statewide land use goals to do that. Just going into a little bit more detail there, like the cable crossing example we talked about. And other than that, it's also just individual decisions by those local governments on a given application, which is what we were talking about in terms of it really does make a difference to protecting those coastal resources to have people that are engaged, paying attention to what is going on, and coming and giving their voice. A lot of these developments and projects go through without any comment, and a lot of cases that can allow, you know, something that would otherwise be prohibited by a local ordinance or by the state goals to get through because no one was there watching it. Yeah, I think that covers what I had to say for the local part, and I will leave the state part to Meg as the expert.
Well, I'll speak, I guess, just to DLCD specifically. I mean, we don't specifically ourselves permit things. I think our main job is to ensure that the coastal or all of the land use planning goals are being implemented and applied consistently at the local level and at the state agency level. And we also provide a lot of technical assistance. So we come up with like guides and tools and data and maps and all sorts of things for local governments. I would say they're our main clientele. And so that's who we're kind of creating resources for. And then, you know, we work specifically with them on permits and plan amendments and all sorts of planning related issues all the time. We're with them all the time. And I think, you know, as probably anyone could guess or has experienced, the coast in Oregon is pretty rural compared to a lot of other coastal states, and planning departments are typically fairly small, and maybe it's just one staff person or maybe even a half staff person or a contractor. who's only there, 1 day a week processing permits. So they definitely have not a lot of capacity, particularly for long range planning topics. So I think that's where we tried to come in and provide that extra capacity and resources for them. And in particular with climate change impacts, our agency is looking we kind of work in 3 main buckets for both or adaptation, sequestration, and mitigation. And so we have sort of programs and priorities in all 3 of those buckets that we're working towards. And I think one of the strengths that our agency provides is that we're the Department of Land Conservation and Development. We see a lot of sides. We're about balancing things, and we work with everyone, and we're really good at coordinating. And so if we see something like happening over there with like the Department of Environmental Quality, and then there's something over here happening with Business Oregon, we can help connect them. And so they talk to each other and try to share resources and initiatives and not reinvent the wheel and things like that. So I think that's one of the strengths that we bring to the table, is that we're really good at coordinating and collaborating with our partners at the state and local level. But there is a lot of work to be done for sure.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Not seeing any more questions. We can wind this up. I want to quickly just give you a couple of previews of opportunities to get involved at the state level. One, the state parks, Oregon Parks and Recreation Department, will be launching what's called a rulemaking process with the goal of revisiting many of the regulations that involve permitting for shoreline armoring and other alterations of the shoreline. If they stay on their schedule, they hope to actually get started with that this fall. And there will be opportunities for public comment on that, and follow Oregon Shores, and we will definitely be letting you know about that. And when it comes to public access issues, I know Meg will be working on starting to work up drafts of rules for a rulemaking process, which last I heard was going to actually take place next summer. So that's a ways off. But again, you have public access concerns, there will be an opportunity to get involved in a public process sometime soon. And again, track Oregon Shores, and we will definitely be informing you about that. And let me just say one more time that in addition to all the information you've got here, Oregon Shores is there to get involved in land use issues that do have conservation implications. So definitely feel invited to contact us if you do have concerns, and we can, at the very least, provide some coaching on how to get involved with the land use issues. And if it's a significant one, we can get involved ourselves. So wait, no, same question, never mind. So I think we've covered everything we can tonight. Thanks very much for attending. Many thanks to both Eric Riston and Meg Reed for providing all this information. And we look forward to working with you to protect the coast. Good night, everyone.